Hey guys, happy Sunday Eve. Um, Last week I spent a couple of days in Montgomery, Alabama. I went to visit the Legacy Museum from Enslavement to Mass Incarceration, as well as the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. Both sites just recently opened around the end of April, a couple of weeks ago. And I'm sure you're familiar with these sites or you've heard of them. The museum and memorial have received quite a bit of press coverage and media attention, most notably featured in a segment on 60 Minutes by Oprah Winfrey a few weeks ago. Um, and these two projects have been in the works for the past 8 years now, spearheaded by the Equal Justice Initiative, EJI, and its founder, Bryan Stevenson. And the intentions around opening the museum and memorial, one, was so that visitors would be forced to confront and acknowledge the very dark, recent past of our nation's history, um, regarding lynchings that took place, terrorizing blacks and black communities as far north as Pennsylvania, where I'm from, as has been documented, as well as in the South during the Jim Crow era, 19th and early 20th centuries. And these were lynchings that really took place for the sake of terrorizing black communities and upholding white supremacist culture and thinking and ideology and segregation. Um, Another intention behind the museum and memorial was to show the narrative of how the domestic slave trade in this country has evolved into the mass incarceration of black and brown people at a very disproportionate rate, to white people in this country. And then finally, as you'll hear Bryan Stevenson say time and time again, to foster healing. He essentially says that healing within the black community around slavery, and lynching cannot begin unless wrongdoing is acknowledged. And at both the museum and memorial, you have a very visceral confrontation that you can't help but to acknowledge. Um, I'm going to post some pictures that I took, if you're interested in seeing them at all. But I also wanted to do a quick video just to kind of share some reflections as I'm still processing my experience. Um, I'll also make this post public in the event that you want to share it with some of your friends. Um, the museum was pretty overwhelming for obvious reasons. The site itself is housed in a warehouse that was once a slave warehouse where slaves were auctioned. And it's a very interactive museum as well. Not even 5 minutes in, there are these slave pens that were constructed within the walls of this space. And in each pen is a hologram of someone reciting slave narratives, firsthand accounts from slaves that have been collected. And I think a lot of these narratives have been stored and housed at the Library of Congress in DC. And there was this one narrative of a gentleman by the name of John Brown, and he talks about his experience being auctioned off along with his siblings, and how his mother begged in anguish for the slave auctioneers not to separate her from all 7 of her children, that she would at least be able to keep the littlest one with her. And John Brown continues that his mother was shown no compassion whatsoever. In fact, she was beaten for begging, at which point she cried out loud, "Why doesn't God just kill me?" And so there were these narratives throughout the museum that were just heartbreaking, to say the least. There were also slave catalogs posted throughout the museum as well, catalogs that read like the classifieds in today's newspapers, essentially describing the slaves that were for sale. Mind you, these are human beings. Some of these narratives read something to the effect of able-bodied man, good with a saw, fine Negro woman, good in the kitchen. And these narratives paint a very sobering picture of how slaves were just seen as commodities and treated so inhumanely. There were also images of lynchings, newspaper articles announcing when lynchings would be taking place. And then, of course, as you go through the museum, you see the narrative of how domestic slavery had evolved into mass incarceration. There were these makeshift prison booths created where you could actually pick up the phone, and in front of you was a screen of an inmate and a video recording of them telling their story of how they were on death row, wrongfully accused, pregnant, and incarcerated, and all of them were black people. Letters from inmates around the country sent to EJI and Bryan Stevenson asking for help. EJI, in case you don't know, is a nonprofit that focuses on criminal justice reform and particularly getting death penalty inmates off death row for wrongful convictions. And then there were videos that talked about a lot of the victims of lynching during the Jim Crow era and post-Reconstruction. One story told a story that will stay with me, was that of Jesse Washington. He was a black man lynched in Texas. He had escaped one lynch mob and returned for his family. And when he returned, word got out that he was back in town. He was caught and shot, severely wounded. Doctors were instructed to keep him alive so that he could be lynched. And advertisements were published in several newspapers inviting people as far north as New York to come and watch this spectacle, as lynchings were back then, spectacles and forms of entertainment. And 15,000 white men, women, and children showed up to watch Jesse Washington be lynched. He was strung from a tree in the town square. He was shot at. 200 bullets went through his body. One bullet struck the noose that hung him, and he fell to the ground. And when he fell, he was set on fire. After his body was burned, he was dismembered, and spectators took body parts as souvenirs. The whole event was captured in the form of postcards and sent to friends and families and relatives. After watching this video, all I could think to myself was how ironic it was that black people were called savages, when really white people were the savages back then. And I also couldn't help but to think that if the struggles of my ancestors, their pain, their anger, their resentment runs through my veins, their oppression runs through my veins, then the savagery of white people's ancestors must run through the veins of white people as well. When I left the museum, I went to the Memorial for Peace and Justice, and when you get there, there are these 6-foot steel columns throughout, 804 total, that represents the 804 counties throughout the country where lynchings had been documented. And etched on each column are the names of victims. And when you first get there, these columns are bolted on the ground, and then as you walk through the memorial, the ground kind of gives way, and the columns are then lifted. They're erected above your head. And it paints a very visual image of how many victims, Black people, were lynched. And as you make your way towards the exit of the memorial, there are plaques that name victims and why they were lynched. And the reasons for lynching were as absurd as Trayvon Martin being killed for walking at night with a hoodie on, Skittles in his pocket. Or Tamir Rice playing with a toy gun in a park, shot by police officers. Renika Boyd, who was hanging out with friends in Illinois and Chicago, killed. All of these reasons that you see in this memorial reflect the absurdity of what we read today when we have to hear about why Black and brown men and women are being murdered, and how the white police officers are going free, just like lynch mobs went free back then. There was the case of 2 teenage Black boys lynched because a white girl said that they were frightening. Or the lynching of Mary Turner and her unborn child because she complained that her husband had been lynched. Or the lynching of a Black man in Ohio for standing around in a white neighborhood. I can't help but to think of Stephon Clark, shot 20 times in his own backyard on his cell phone because cops thought he had a gun. I also was struck by the number of lynchings that occurred because of white women. I did a lot of reclaiming in Montgomery. I don't think I've ever received such a history lesson, and I'm pretty sure that this is not at all taught in our schools to this extent. If you ever get an opportunity to go to Montgomery, Alabama, please do visit the Legacy Museum and Memorial. But in the meantime, I hope that should you care to listen to this video and look at my photos, that you will hold this reflection and acknowledge how racism has damaged us. And I don't just mean Black people, I mean white people as well. And racism is still very much alive and well today. And if anything, I hope that what you see in some of these images tug on your compassion, foster an ability to put yourselves in the shoes of Black people today and back then, why we are so adamant about liberation. And that's it. I'm still processing, and so I'm open to continuing this conversation. And in the meantime, thank you for listening, and enjoy the rest of your evening.